He had gone out for the lost calf. The snow had started before noon, and by mid-afternoon it was the kind of snow that makes decisions for you. And the calf had been missing since morning, and Hank Calder had followed its tracks across his east pasture and through the fence line and into the stand of cottonwoods along the creek, which was where he found the calf, and 20 feet further on, the woman. She was in the hollow of the largest cottonwood, not shelter exactly, more the refusal of full exposure, with her back against the bark and her knees drawn up, and her coat open despite the cold, and a sound coming from her that he recognized, because he had been ranching cattle for 22 years and knew what a creature in hard labor sounded like, and the sound was the same regardless of the creature, which was the thought that went through his mind in the half-second before he dropped the rope and crossed the 20 feet and crouched beside her. "How long?" he said. She looked at him. Her face was the color of old snow, and her eyes were the particular dark of a person who has used up most of what they had and is running on the remainder. She was a large woman, broad through the hips, full-figured, the kind of body that had the bearing of someone accustomed to physical work, though none of that work had prepared her for this, alone, in November, in a stand of cottonwoods in the back end of someone else's property. "Since morning," she said. He did not ask anything else. He had been ranching for 22 years and had learned that there was a moment in every difficult situation when talking became a postponement of the thing that needed doing, and this was past that moment. He took off his coat. He did what needed doing. If this story already has you, subscribe to this channel right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me, because what Hank Calder does in those cottonwoods along the creek in November of 1880 is only the beginning of what makes him legend. The rest of it takes the whole winter to become clear. Her name was Clara Sutton. He learned this after, when she was in his house and the baby was wrapped in his mother's quilt and the fire was built high enough that the room had stopped apologizing for itself. She told him in the careful, abbreviated way of a woman managing the energy she had left, and he received it the same way, without follow-up questions, because the questions would be there tomorrow and she would not. She had been married. The husband had left in August, which was 3 months before the baby came, and 9 months and 2 weeks after the wedding, a sequence of numbers whose implications Clara offered without editorial. In a tone so even that Hank understood she had done the arithmetic many times and had arrived at a distance from it that was not indifference, but something harder and more deliberate. She had been living in a rented room in Hardin Creek, 7 miles west, and had been on her way to the doctor's house. She had felt the beginning of things that morning, and had started walking, because the room in town had no stove worth mentioning, and the doctor's house had a good one, and she had misjudged both the distance and the weather, which was a mistake she acknowledged with the brevity of a woman who was too tired to be anything but honest. "You walked 7 miles, he said, in labor. 5, she said, before I stopped being able to. He looked at the baby, who was asleep with the focused seriousness of someone who had just accomplished something enormous and intended to rest adequately afterward. "Girl," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "What's her name?" Clara looked at the ceiling. I hadn't decided yet. I was going to decide when I saw her." He looked at the baby. "She looks like someone who knows exactly what she's about," he said. Clara almost smiled. It was the first almost smile, and he filed it the way a man files the first appearance of a thing he had not expected to matter to him. "She does," Clara said. "She does look like that." She named her May, which she had been considering since June, and which she said aloud for the first time in Hank Calder's front room, with the fire high and the snow pressing on the windows, and the name fit the child the way names sometimes fit from the first moment, as though the child had always had it and was simply waiting for someone to figure it out. She stayed because she had to. Not because he asked her to, he did not ask, which she noticed, but because December in Montana at 9,000 feet is not the season for a woman and a newborn to go anywhere, and the rented room in Hardin Creek had a landlord she was 3 weeks behind with, and a stove that could not be trusted, and Hank Calder's house was warm, and the food was sufficient, and he had, without discussion, established himself as the kind of man who would not make the situation worse. She learned this in increments. On the first morning, she woke to the stove already lit, and coffee on, and silence in the house, because he had taken himself to the barn so she could have the waking to herself. On the second morning, she found him in the kitchen, making something that was technically porridge in the way that a fence post is technically furniture, structurally present but offering little comfort, and she moved him gently out of the way and took over, and he went and sat at the table without protest, which she took as either good sense or good manners, and decided it was probably both. By the end of the first week, she was cooking the meals. This was not an arrangement they discussed. It was a thing that happened the way things happen between practical people who are sharing a space. The more capable person doing the thing, the less capable person not impeding them. Both parties finding this satisfactory. He was good with May in the way that surprised her. She had expected the particular careful distance that men often maintain from other people's infants. The held at arm's length quality of a person who has decided the baby is someone else's problem. But Hank Calder picked May up with the matter-of-fact competence of a man who had done something like this before and was not going to perform uncertainty about it. "You've held babies," she said, watching him. "I had a daughter," he said. He said it in the same careful tone he used for all the things he did not elaborate on, and she learned to read those tones the way she was reading everything about him, systematically, with the attention of someone who knows they are going to need the information later. She did not ask. She filed it, and let the silence be. She was making herself useful in the ways available to a woman who was recovering from a birth in a stranger's house in November. She had the accounts reorganized in a week. She had been a school teacher for 4 years before the marriage, and had the particular relationship to ledgers of someone who has spent a significant portion of their life explaining them to people who did not want to understand them. She found 3 arithmetic errors in the cattle records that had compounded themselves across 2 seasons, which she corrected and noted in the margin, and left the ledger open to that page on the desk. He came in from the barn and found it, and stood at the desk for a moment. "The third one's been bothering me since September," he said. "I can see that," she said. "The ink is different. You came back to it." "Couldn't find it," he said. "It was in how you'd set up the columns," she said. "The July entries carry over wrong. Fixed it." He closed the ledger. He opened it again to the page she had corrected. He stood there a moment longer. "Thank you," he said. "You can pay me in firewood," she said. "I've been cold on that side of the room." He looked at the east wall. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved in the way she had catalogued as the equivalent, in him, of a full laugh in another man. He cut firewood that afternoon. He stacked it himself against the east wall more than she would need for a week, and said nothing about it, and she said nothing about it. And May slept in the crib he had assembled from memory out of boards in the barn. Because apparently he had done this before and remembered how. On the 14th night, May woke at 2 in the morning in the particular register of a baby who has decided that now is the time and will not be reasoned with. Clara rose and was settling her when she heard him, not footsteps. Just the change in the quality of silence that means another person in a house is awake and aware. She found him in the kitchen doorway when she came out for water, a large man in the dark holding the doorframe with one hand and looking at nothing, and she thought she understood the look, someone woken from sleep by a child's cry, in a house where he had once heard that and now did not. She said, very quietly, "She's all right." "Hungry," he said. "I know." He did not move. My daughter's name was Rose. Clara stood in the hall with May against her chest and said nothing. "She was 4, he said. "Fever, 6 years ago." He looked at his hand on the doorframe. "My wife went a year after. I think she went looking for her." Clara looked at May's face, which was the face of a person focused entirely on a single urgent problem and unbothered by the complexity of the world around her. "I'm sorry," she said. Not the performed sorrow of condolence, but the plain version, the one that means, "I have received this, and I am holding it with care." He nodded once. "She looks like Rose," he said. "Around the eyes, not the same, but in the same country." Clara felt something shift in her understanding of the past 14 days, the way he held May, the crib assembled from memory, the quality of his attention when the baby made a sound. He had been doing all of it with 6 years of practice and 6 years of grief. And she had not known. And now she did. And the knowing changed the shape of everything she had catalogued. She said, "Would you like to hold her while I heat the water?" He looked at May. He came and took her, carefully, with the practiced hands of a man who had held a small person before and knew where the head went and how to distribute the weight. And Clara went to the stove. And when she came back with the warm water, he was standing in the kitchen with May against his chest and his eyes closed, not asleep, but somewhere private. And she left him there for a moment before she said his name. He opened his eyes. "She's quieted," he said, which was true. "She does that," Clara said, "when someone's holding her right." She took May back. He stood in the kitchen for another moment, and then he went back to his room, and Clara sat by the stove and fed the baby and thought about a man who had lost everything and had spent 6 years in a house that kept the shape of what had been in it. And she thought about what it cost a person to do that and keep going. And she thought about what she required in a life, and whether what she required and what was available were, unexpectedly, in the same place. The man who came in February was the landlord from Hardin Creek, a dry, self-important man named Aldris, who had Clara's 3 weeks of back rent itemized on a paper he carried in his coat pocket, and who had, in addition to the back rent, a formal notice of abandonment of tenancy, and a question about the disposition of her remaining goods, which amounted to a trunk of clothes and a box of books and a crib he had already let to another tenant since she had not come back for it. He sat at Hank Calder's kitchen table and put the paper down. Clara looked at it. Hank, who had been at the desk in the corner when Aldris arrived and had stayed there, came to the table. He looked at the paper. He looked at Aldris. He said, "She had a baby in a snowstorm in November, in a stand of cottonwoods on my east pasture. What she owes you for the room she did not get to use because she was otherwise engaged is a conversation I'm prepared to have at some length." Aldris began to explain the terms of the rental agreement. Hank said, "The crib." Aldris stopped. "The crib you let to another tenant," Hank said. "The one that belonged to her. I'll need the value of that replaced before anything else is discussed." "And the books?" "The agreement states," Aldris began. "The agreement," Hank said, "was for a room with a stove. I understand the stove did not work reliably. That is a material deficiency that affects the terms. I also understand that the room is now let again, which means you've had income from it since November, which covers her outstanding balance." He picked up the paper. He looked at it for a moment. "Your arithmetic is wrong as well. I've seen enough bad arithmetic in the past 2 months to have developed a low tolerance for it." He set the paper back down. Aldous looked at Clara. "She is a resident of this property," Hank said. "She and her daughter. That is a permanent arrangement." He looked at Aldous. "I suggest you account for the crib, and we'll call the rest settled." Aldous sat for a moment longer. Then he left without the paper, which Hank set on the fire that evening without looking at it. Clara watched him do it. She said, "You didn't ask me." He looked at the fire. "No," he said. "I should have." He turned. "Is it all right, being a permanent arrangement?" She looked at him, at the large, careful man who had found her in a cottonwood hollow and done what needed doing and said nothing about it, and held her daughter in the dark, and kept the fire going, and fixed the arithmetic, and burned the landlord's paper without looking at it. "Yes," she said. "It's all right." He nodded. He went back to the desk. She stood by the fire for a moment, with May on her hip, and she thought about what had just happened, which was that a man had declared her permanent without consulting her, and then, when she pointed it out, had asked. Both of those things mattered. The second one slightly more. The wedding was in March, in the Hardin Creek Church, in front of a town that had been discussing Hank Calder and the woman from the Cottonwoods since December, when the story had made its first circuit of the county in the way that extraordinary things do. Compressed and embellished, and essentially true. What the town had heard was this: that Hank Calder had found a woman giving birth alone in the November snow, and had delivered the baby himself and carried them both to his house and kept them through the winter. This was accurate. What the town had added was that he had done it quietly, without telling anyone, and had said nothing to the county records office or the doctor or the sheriff, or any of the people a man announces such things to when he wants credit for them. He had simply done it, and gone back to his cattle and his accounts and his house. And the town had found out the way the town finds out about quiet men. Sideways, gradually, from the accumulated evidence of a woman who appeared at the dry goods store in January looking well, and a baby who appeared alongside her looking like a person who had been cared for properly. This was also accurate. What made him legend was neither of these things. What made him legend was the crib. When Aldous left Hank Calder's kitchen without the paper, and went back to Hardin Creek and was met, as he inevitably was, by the people who wanted to know how it had gone, he said that Calder had asked for the value of the crib, meaning the crib that Clara had brought to the rented room, and that Aldous had let to another tenant in November when she didn't come back for it, meaning the crib she had prepared for the baby before the baby came, in a rented room with a bad stove, alone. Aldous said it as a complaint, that Calder had made an issue of the crib, which was a minor article, not worth the discussion. The town heard it differently. The town heard that Hank Calder, a man who had not, in 6 years, asked anything of anyone, a man who had buried a daughter and a wife and had kept going with the focused, reduced efficiency of someone who has removed everything optional from his life, had sat across a table from a landlord and asked for the value of a crib, not the back rent, not the outstanding balance. The crib, the thing she had prepared, the thing that had been taken while she was in a cottonwood hollow in the snow. People in Hardin Creek talked about the crib for years. It became the version of the story that got told when the full story was too long for the occasion. You know what Calder asked for? And the asking for it, small and specific and entirely without drama, was the thing that the county kept returning to as the clearest picture of who the man was and what he valued and how he moved through the world. In March, Hank Calder married Clara Sutton in the Hardin Creek Church, with May in the arms of the minister's wife and the whole town in attendance, and a snow coming down outside that everyone chose to find romantic rather than inconvenient, because the snow was not the point, and they knew it. The minister said his words. Hank said his in the plain, unadorned voice of a man who is not performing them. Clara said hers in the clear, steady voice she had recovered over the winter from a person who had been alone in a cottonwood hollow, and had decided, in the months since, that she was not going to be alone anymore, and that this was not a concession, but a correction. May, in the arms of the minister's wife, was asleep. She had the particular quality of a baby who has decided that the proceedings do not require her active participation and is resting in preparation for whenever they do. Spring came to the Calder property the way spring comes to Montana, not politely, not all at once, but in a series of provisional advances and retreats, a little more each week, until one morning you look out the window and the cottonwoods along the creek are putting out their first leaves, and the mud has begun to firm up, and the light has changed from the flat white of winter to something with color in it. Clara stood at the kitchen window on one of those mornings and watched the cottonwoods. Hank came in from the first chores and poured his coffee and came to stand beside her. He looked at the cottonwoods, too. "I've been meaning to thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For the crib," she said. "I know what you asked for." He looked back at the window. He was quiet in the way that had become as familiar to her as any language she had ever learned. The quiet that was not absence but consideration, the quiet of a man assembling the right words in the right order. "It was hers," he said. "You made it for her, before she was here." He paused. That mattered. Clara looked at the cottonwoods. "Rose's crib," she said quietly. "Is that where you knew how to build May's?" He was still for a moment. "Yes," he said. She said nothing. She let it sit the way you let important things sit, in the place where they need to be before they can be carried. "I built Rose's when I was 31, he said. I remembered how. Outside, the cottonwoods moved in the morning wind, the first green of the year just showing at the tips of the branches, tentative, the way new things are when they have not yet decided to be fully here. "I know," Clara said. "You built it in the dark, before she was awake." He turned and looked at her. "Third night," she said. "I heard you." "I didn't want to," she stopped. "I didn't want to say anything." "You were." She looked at him. "You were putting something together that you thought you'd already lost the use for. I didn't want to interrupt that." He stood in the kitchen for a long moment. He looked at May, who was in her crib in the front room, making the particular small sounds of a person just beginning to wake and considering whether to commit to it. "She helped," he said. It was the most he had said about it. It was also, Clara understood, the truest thing he knew how to say. She looked at the cottonwoods. She had walked 5 miles in labor in a November snowstorm to reach a doctor who was 7 miles away, and she had not reached him, and instead she had been found by a man who had gone out for a lost calf, and had done what needed doing, and had never, not once, made her feel that what needed doing was a burden. She had spent the winter becoming certain of this, and she was certain now, in the way she was certain of the things she had tested thoroughly, the kind of certain that does not require reassurance, because it is built on enough evidence to stand without it. She had needed to be found. She had been found, not rescued. She would have survived, or she would not have. And either way the choice would have been hers, and the outcome would have been independent of anyone else's wishes. But found, seen in the difficulty, met in the difficulty, without drama or ceremony, by a man who dropped a rope and crossed 20 feet and crouched beside her and said how long, and then did what needed doing. That was what she had needed. That was what the legend was made of, not the drama of the finding, but the quality of what came after. The fire kept. The porridge attempted. The crib built in the dark. The paper burned. The question asked, "Is it all right?" being a permanent arrangement. It was. It had been, she thought, from the moment he crossed those 20 feet without hesitating. The rest had only been the time it took to become certain.